So maybe you resonate with that idea that when you first start journeying with Jesus, you find that this idea of it being an all-in project is something that you can really get behind, but then after a little while, you start to have to dilute that a little bit because it really doesn't seem realistic that you're going to base your entire life around Jesus and his vision for you. There's a story in the Gospels in which the disciples have followed Jesus for a little bit. His 12 disciples that he's picked up along the way as he's gathering a troop around him. And you wonder as you read the story we're about to read if maybe they started to become a little bit comfortable, maybe a little bit complacent in their calling in the world, or maybe they started to kind of recline into their place in the community without really giving anything back out. And so what Jesus does is he flips it around and he sends them back out into the world to disrupt their couch potato spirituality and say, actually, this is either an all-in project or it's an opt-out project. Let's see what Jesus does with his 12 disciples in the story here. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. He sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. He told them, take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. So presumably they're allowed to take one shirt, which that's good news, not literally nothing. Whatever house you enter, that's why you need a shirt, because you're going into people's houses. Stay there until you leave that town. If people don't welcome you, because you didn't get the memo about the shirt, leave their town and shake the dust off of your feet as a testimony against them. So they set out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. So if I had to give a name to our conversation tonight, to what we're engaging with, I want to call it this: take nothing for the journey. See, that's a profoundly countercultural idea when you really get into it, isn't it? Because how often do we think of life in the categories of how much we accumulate along the journey? And those categories might be different for all of us. It's not necessarily a materialistic thing. Maybe the thing that you base your life around in terms of what you accumulate is just a happy family. Maybe you're going to value your life on the basis of whether you end up happily married with 2.5 kids or not. Or maybe for you it's a good education. Or maybe for you it's a fulfilling career. Or maybe for you it is money. I was talking to a young adult a couple of months ago. And he said this to me. I found it profoundly moving and fascinating as an insight into his life. He said, Adam, I know people who are incredibly rich and they have a completely meaningless life. Their life has no fulfillment. But, and we kind of all know that piece, but then he said this, I also know people who seem to live a profoundly meaningful life, and yet they can't put food on the table. And his question was this. It's a question that maybe all of us have asked. Do I center my life around money or around meaning? Now, replace that word money, because that was his piece, for whatever you need that to be. But the question that all of us have asked, whether it's money or not, is what is the one thing that is actually worth my whole life and being? What is the one thing that is actually worth pursuing? Now, that's why I kind of threw this question out to you a little bit, and I gave myself more grace than I gave you, because I couldn't narrow the answer down to one thing that people usually orient their lives around. I narrowed it down to three, okay? So I think there's three things that we tend to orient our lives around that capture pretty much everything else underneath this umbrella. Three things that we tend to take along for the journey that keep us from a singular pursuit of Jesus. And it's security, status, and shortcuts. And that's what I want to get into tonight. You see, Jesus comes along. A lot of you are like, yeah, I don't really agree with that. You missed out loads. But let's just see what happens. So Jesus comes along to his disciples or to people who are exploring the idea of orienting their life around him. And he says, come along and follow me. And they say maybe something like what you find yourself at times tempted to say to Jesus, I'd love to. This sounds amazing. Let me just go pack my bags. Let me just put a little travel purse together, all right? I'll bring that extra shirt, or I'll bring my house along with me, or my family, or my career, or my goals, or my aspirations, or my mortgage, whatever it is. Because all of us, when we're invited into this Jesus life, have a sneaking suspicion that whatever it is that Jesus invites us into, it isn't one that is going to be oriented around our security. That whatever it is that Jesus is inviting us into, it probably isn't going to be the most efficient and effective way to securing our status and our standing in the world. That whatever it is he invites us into, it's not going to be the easiest, quickest, most expedient way to reach our goals. And Jesus says, if you want to follow me, the sad news is that you can't bring that stuff along with you. Now, the sad news is also good news, because this temptation of ours to orient our life around things other than Christ is not just our temptation, it's also Jesus's. You probably know the story in the Gospels that shapes this practice of Lent that Tori referred to. And it's a story in which Jesus is tempted with the exact same things as us. It says this: Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry, which in the Greek is like, no duh, obviously he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Jesus answered, it's written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. The devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down. For it's written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they're going to lift you up in their hands so that you won't strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered him, it is also written, don't put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give to you, he said, if you'll bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it's written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him and angels came and attended him. So we've been in the season of Lent. And often we think of Lent in the categories of giving up stuff because it's unhealthy for you and you don't have the willpower to give it up any of the rest of the year. Certainly not the whole rest of the year. So you just do it for 40 days before Easter. So you give up sugar, or you give up social media, or you give up coffee, which, interestingly, I don't know if you know this, is why Roll Up the Rim happens during Lent. Did you know that? Because Tim Hortons see their profits dip so much from people giving up caffeine, so they're like, let's give out free coffee and donuts, because people have that little willpower. It's like, I'll give up caffeine, unless it's free. I mean, I'm not stupid, right? So that's why that happens. And then Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, this story that frames this practice of Lent. But he's not tempted by things that he really ought to give up anyway. Jesus is not on a 40-day gluten cleanse or anything like that, okay? He's not tempted by sugar and social media and Tim Hortons, because who is tempted by Tim Hortons really? I mean, let's be honest, people. Right, so instead, he's tempted by something different, something that in some sense is the same thing underlying all of our provisional temptations. He's tempted to separate out his allegiance to God. He's tempted to orient his life around more than one singular pursuit of God. And that's important for us to remember. Because the perennial temptation for Jesus followers, or maybe for all of us, whether you call yourself a Christian or not, is not just to those things that are unhealthy. It's not just to those things that are dysfunctional or broken or bad for us. Because we all know we shouldn't do things that are bad for us. No, the perennial temptation for Jesus followers is to orient our lives around more than just Jesus. To base our lives and our values and our vision of life around Jesus, but also other things. To clutter our priorities and values. To make faith and spirituality just one option on the table amongst all the other options that you can pick or choose from, depending on what you need in that circumstance. And the devil comes to Jesus and he tempts him with this exact thing. He says, follow God, do your thing, but leave some other options on the table. Don't be stupid. Don't be naive. He says, have an exit plan in place. Have an insurance policy in place. Have a shortcut out of this life in case it all goes wrong and it turns out not to work. And Jesus says, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Let's translate it this way. There is no safety net. There is no shortcut. There is no exit plan. In 1519, you probably know the story, Hernando Cortez landed on the beaches of Veracruz, now Mexico, to start his conquest into Central America. And you know the story probably as well as I do, that he decided the only way to really get his men to actually work hard at this, the only way to ensure success in this venture of theirs was to make sure there was no way to go back home, that there was no exit strategy. So what did he do? He burnt all his boats. Which is kind of a stupid move. It's kind of a bad move. It doesn't make any sense. To eliminate your only exit plan doesn't make any sense. But Cortez reasoned this, that the only way to move forward is to ensure that there is no option for going backwards, to eliminate your only exit plan. Jesus says the same thing to a prospective disciple in Luke 9. As they're walking along the road, a man said to Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." And how many of us have said that to Jesus? And Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. No one who puts their hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God." He says, the only way to make sure that you're going to move forward is to ensure there's no possibility of going backwards. We said throughout this series that often what we try and do in faith is we follow Jesus. We say like this guy, "I will follow you wherever you go," but we also want to drag everything else along behind us on the journey. So we want to make sure that we have our house, that we have our family, that we have our goals and visions and plans, so that we don't have to orient our life only around the vision that Jesus is inviting us into. We try to step into his mission, but also make sure there's a way out in case it all goes wrong. And I get it. And I want to say this to you. I really understand that sense of cluttered priorities, because you don't want to orient your life around one thing. It doesn't make any sense. To orient your life around one singular pursuit is risky, because what if it turns out to be wrong? And that is a true idea. That's an important thing for you to engage with if the goal of your life is security. If the goal of your life is safety, if the goal of your life is the lowest risk investment, then don't orient your life around one thing. Have options on the table in case something goes wrong. But to orient your life around the singular pursuit of Jesus means to stake your life on a high risk. Not that this will be the most secure life, but the risk that it could turn out to be the most meaningful kind of life you could possibly have pursued. I want to tell you a couple of stories tonight. They're, I suppose, a two-part story about one story that happened in my life a few years ago. When I was at university, and I've told you this before, I was deeply passionate about serving the homeless. And I decided that I wanted to do this in London, where there's an incredibly vast homeless population and deeply broken stories. And I reasoned between my first and second years of university, I decided the best way to serve the homeless was to be the homeless. And so I packed up with a buddy of mine and hit the streets of London. So we took a sleeping bag, a Bible, a toothbrush. Sorry, we took two of all these things, otherwise that's super creepy. Some toothpaste, probably one toothpaste, I don't know. And £4, not like of anything. £4, that's the currency in England. So like $6 or $7, right? Which we immediately lost, by the way, as soon as we got off the train. See, we figured that the best way for us to give God a fighting chance at making this season of life significant was to make sure we had no exit plan. No safety net. We didn't take cell phones. We didn't take anything that we could communicate with family with. And by the way, we committed to two things. The first was that we wouldn't beg, because we didn't want to rely on other people's money, and we certainly didn't want to take genuine homeless people's money, and we wouldn't take any space in a hostel or a shelter for the same reasons. Now, I'm not going to tell you everything that happened over the course of what turned out to be 7 days, I think. But I want to tell you one thing about it. The first 3 or 4 days were filled with the most amazing provision of God. And maybe you've had moments in your life in which something happens, and you can't really build a theology out of it or make any sense of it, but you just say, you know what? This happened, and I can only attribute it to God. I want to tell you one of these stories, but here's a caveat. I'm not building a theology out of this. I'm not saying this is what happens when you're homeless, and I'm not saying God always provides this way. I'm just telling you that it happened. We got off the train, we started walking. We walked for probably 3 or 4 hours aimlessly around London. And we started to get really hungry. So we prayed for food. I said amen, and my friend who I was with said, as a joke, I'd love some sushi, God. We walked for another 400 yards and walked past a sushi restaurant. And outside of it, there was a big bag filled with sushi that had all been freshly prepared, and there was a note on top that said, please take freshly prepared today. I don't build a theology out of how God provided sushi for us in London. I'm just telling you that it happened. Now, the reason I tell you that happened is because of what happened next. Those 3 or 4 days were filled with that kind of ridiculous, radical provision. But the 4th day, there was no food. The 4th day, we walked around the whole day and there was no food to be found. And that night we tried to fall asleep, but we couldn't sleep. Then the fifth day came, no food. Fifth night, no sleep. Sixth day, sixth night, same thing. We got to the seventh day. We'd now been 50 hours without sleep and 60 hours without food. And I don't know how to explain this to you, but the most profound thing happened. We were happy. Probably the happiest I've ever been in my life. Let me put it this way. We were satisfied with something that was much deeper than food. We were content. We were able to say, you know what? If the God who provided for us chooses not to provide for us, we don't care. We'll serve him anyway. Now, the reason I tell you that story is because it's an important thing to know that following Jesus will not guarantee a full stomach. Following Jesus won't guarantee that you will live with a mortgage and comfortably pay it off. It doesn't guarantee security or comfort or convenience or a safety net. Because Jesus at no point promises security, he promises significance. He promises that this life that for you might be very hard, and at times you might go without food and sleep, will be the most meaningful life you possibly could have. We thought God had taken us to London to serve the homeless and the vulnerable, and we did do a lot of that as well. But we discovered that actually he brought us there to see what happens when you follow Jesus without an exit plan. When you follow Jesus and you burn your safety nets behind you. When you orient your life solely around pursuing Jesus' idea of significance instead of your own watered down version of security. So let me ask you this question. What's your safety net? What are the alternate options that you have in place in case it turns out that Jesus isn't all he promised to be? The second thing that I think keeps us from orienting our lives only around Jesus is status. Have you ever noticed that we tend to predicate our status on the things that we've worked the hardest to achieve? Have you ever noticed that? So you'll base your sense of self in the world around your education because you've worked really hard to get a good education, or a successful career, that you're more successful than the guy next to you, or maybe your physical health and you work really hard at that. And the list goes on endlessly. There's an infinite variety of things on which we predicate our status and standing in the world, but almost all of them are rooted in something we've achieved, something we've worked for. Now, you know that this is true because you also know what it's like when you meet somebody who is proud and arrogant about things that they didn't do anything to achieve. So my brother-in-law is 6'8", okay? And he's tremendously proud of being 6'8". Like, he will talk about it non-stop. The first time I met him, which was about 3 years ago, he was about 6'6" back then, and like 16, so ridiculous. And he had a 28-inch waist, so he really looked silly. But he was very proud of his height. The first time I met him, he walked up to me and towered over me and said, "Hi, I'm Graham." He was so proud of the fact that he was 6'6", now 6'8", which is weird when you think about it because he didn't really do anything to achieve that in his life. And you know what it's like to meet people like that? It's kind of bizarre. People who seem to have effortless good looks. But you also know that you've put in a lot of effort to make that look effortless, and that's kind of why you're proud of it. You know what I mean? Those kind of people. You're all thinking, Adam, we know that's you. That's all right. It's fine. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Let's just continue with the lie and the facade that I don't try and look this good. All right, so then what happens is you meet Jesus, and Jesus comes along, and he calls his disciples, and then he says to you, you actually have to be intentionally and ruthlessly difficult and hard on yourself to eliminate anything in your life that's going to tempt you to base your sense of self on anything except me. And by the way, this happens in ministry as well. And by ministry, I don't mean church ministry. I mean doing anything that you think God's told you to do. What happens is Jesus calls you into something, and immediately you start to tell yourself, yeah, I'm pretty talented. It makes sense that Jesus would call me into this. That's not why he called you. Your talent might help. I'm not saying you're not talented. And it might be part of the reason that he called you in, but actually the deeper reason is that Jesus called you because he wants you to predicate your sense of self on something bigger than yourself. And why is that the case? Well, it's because, as Jesus says, freely you've received, now freely give. It's because everything that you've received, you have received. Ask the question this way. Are the best things in your life things that you can honestly say are gifts from God? That's a tricky question. Because if the answer is yes, then you have to stop taking credit for it. But if the answer is no, then you probably need to find a way to get rid of them. You probably need to find a way to give them back to Jesus, or to engineer them into something that can have a meaning and a purpose that is bigger than your own sense of self. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose book I've been trying to get you to buy for this whole series, says it this way: to be a messenger of Jesus Christ confers no personal privileges, no title to power or renown. It means showing people that you have plenty of riches to give away, but you desire nothing for yourself, neither possessions, nor admiration, nor regard. And this is the sucker punch. And least of all, their gratitude. Least of all, their gratitude for anything that you do to be Jesus to them. We started this series by saying this: Jesus is bad for your career. I wonder if part of the reason that we keep our other options open and on the table, that we keep a couple of boats on the beach in case we need an exit plan, is because we know that following Jesus is not the most constructive career path. It's not the best way to earn a reputation. It's not the best way to climb the ladder or to acquire more status and social capital. And most importantly, following Jesus is not the quickest way. Let's circle back to our story. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Now, I just want to say this really quickly. It's important that you realize the temptations that Jesus is receiving, they're not trivial. They're real temptations. It's not just fake. It's not like he's pretending to be tempted, but he's the Son of God, so it's kind of easy for him to just bypass it. No. The reason they're real temptations is because they're the exact things that he came to receive. So the devil says, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. And Jesus must in part be thinking, that's exactly why I came. I came to get the kingdom and to give it back to God. The problem is this: Jesus came to receive a kingdom, but he came to get it through the cross. And the devil says, I'll give you all of this. I'll give you all the stuff that you are supposed to have, the life and call and mission that you've been brought here to fulfill, but I'll take you the easy way round. You don't have to go the way of the cross. All you have to do is bow down to me. And Jesus says, no. He says it's not about shortcutting my way to the destination. It's about who I follow on the journey. It's about not just getting there, but the way that I get there, even if it means taking the longer, more challenging way around. So part 2 of my story is we kind of come into land tonight. That second or third night in London, we slept through rain and thunder, soaking wet, freezing cold, and having a miserable time. And at some point in there, I think it was our third night, I felt that God wanted both of us to go stay with my brother who lived in East London. Now, let me say this in case you don't know your London map, right? He lived in Bethnal Green, which is on the east side of London, and at the time we were in Kensington, which is on the west side of London, and I don't really know how to get there, but it's 10 kilometers away. London's really big, in case you didn't realize. It's 10 kilometers, and like I said, we lost our 4 pounds, so we weren't taking the subway. So we had no idea which direction to go in, but I felt like God wanted us to stay there. The only thing I knew was this: my brother lives right next to this bridge covered in flowers. Very iconic bridge in London that I would know if I recognized it, because he lived right next to this bridge covered in greenery and flowers. So we started walking. Hours and hours and hours of walking. And about 3 hours later, I stopped, frustrated and flustered and annoyed, and consulted a map on the side of a bus stop. And my friend said to me, oh, we're consulting maps now. So instead I said, okay, I guess that makes sense. So we kept walking without consulting the map. Eventually we'd walked for 5 hours. 5 hours through the rain and thunder and exhausted on very little food. And then we turned a corner at random, and there was the bridge of flowers. Looking back on my journey the next day, I realized that we had walked for about an hour and a half, one street over from where he lived. That if I had walked one street over, I would have realized exactly where we were going. But we were on the wrong side of the street. So there's times in life in which we all want life to be a little bit of an easier journey, isn't it? There's times when we want a map to consult that can tell us how to get where we want to go. Or we want to find a shortcut that we can take that's an easier way around so we can arrive at the destination in the quickest and most expedient way that we possibly can. But we discover along the way And if you've just started walking with Christ or you haven't yet started walking with Christ, at some point you'll discover along the way that God likes the difficult road. Annoyingly, God likes the tangent. He likes the longer and often more trying way round. And the reason for that, the reason he likes that for us and the same reason he liked it for Jesus was because he's not in the business of providing you with the quickest, most efficient way to hit your targets. He's in the business of making you into the person that he wants you to become. And God will take you the longer way round so that everything that doesn't fit that person is going to fall off along the way. Following Jesus means walking unmapped terrain. I was walking yesterday in the woods behind my house. I live in Discovery Ridge. And I realized as soon as you step into the woods, when you look in front of you, it's nothing but untapped nature. It just looks like you've been plopped right into the middle of Narnia, especially at this time of year. But if you turn around 180 degrees, there's no woodlands. It's just houses. It's just civilization. And the Jesus life is kind of like this. When you look ahead of you, you see nothing but unmarked, untrailed, rocky terrain. And if you only turn around and decide to go back, it seems so much more comfortable. The Jesus life is the difference between RVing and camping. Journeying with Jesus is not an RV holiday. It won't be easy. It won't help you feel comfortable and secure. It won't help you climb the career ladder. And when you try and make the Jesus life into an RV holiday, when you try and pretend that your life is oriented around this unmapped terrain of following Jesus and the adventure that that entails, but you're also holding on to a bit of comfort, you're also, and this is what an RV is, as you know, it's dragging your house into the wilderness. So you can go, I went camping for 3 months this year, and it was great. It was just in my house, but in the woods. I hate RVs, right? That's the difference between trying to bring your comfort into the Jesus life instead of leaving your comfort behind so that you can step into a new adventure. It might require leaving everything else behind. It might require letting your comfort and convenience, your hopes and ambitions and dreams fall off along the way until there's nothing left but you and Jesus. So as we close, I want to ask you this question. What are the shortcuts in your life? What are the other roadmaps that you want to consult beside Jesus' vision for your life? Is it the best cultural wisdom that you can find around you about what constitutes a good life? Or is it unquestioned cookie-cut templates of what life is supposed to be like? 2.5 kids, fulfilling career, retirement savings plan? Or do you predicate your decision-making process on what seems like the quickest, most efficient way to success and significance? Because then you meet Jesus, and Jesus calls you to follow him, and you say, I know it's the right way. I know it's the way God's called me to, but it's easier if I just go this way. It's easier if I follow the mapped trail instead of the rocky terrain of following Jesus into the unexplored. And what else are you taking along for the journey? What are the safety nets that you have in place in case it turns out that Jesus isn't everything that he said he was going to be? If it turns out that this faith thing doesn't work for you, what are the things that you're okay because you will be able to fall back on them? Because if easy answers came to your mind for any of the questions I just asked, then you're probably not doing it right. And it's okay, none of us are doing it right. But if easy answers came to your mind about the exact things that you're going to fall back on if it turns out you don't want to follow Jesus anymore, you're probably not following him the way you should. If it's not a risk, if it doesn't cost you anything, if life wouldn't really be disrupted if you stopped following Jesus tomorrow, then it means you're not journeying with him in the way that you're going to get the best out of it. So I want to close tonight and I want to pray for us. And I want to pray a prayer that I wrote when I blogged about my time in London. That's when blogs were still around. Are blogs still around? Oh, they are. Okay, that's good. I'm not as old as I feel. That's perfect. All right. I wrote this prayer that concluded our time spent on the streets of London. I want to pray it over you. So if you want to bow your head, close your eyes, however you want to reflect, let me pray this for us. May you find your life in Christ, casting aside every distraction in the pursuit to which you've been called. May you taste a life altogether rooted in the provision of God. And may you find yourself becoming a radical lover of Christ in the only sense that it means to be radical, which is to follow him wherever he leads you.